We'll close out this afternoon session with our final speaker, Dr. James Louter from Environment Canada, to discuss how to assess environmental impact of these type of studies.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this meeting. I think I'm quite impressed with the caliber of the presentations and with the openness with which you conduct the meeting. So I'm going to talk today about what we do in Canada with respect to these animals, and I realize, looking at the title, that you're not going to see very much of the terminology we've been using a lot today, and that's basically, if there was one take-home message from what I'm going to say, is that we don't need to do that, because we've got an approach which basically is technology agnostic, or it's not predicated by the use of any particular technology. So I want to talk about a little bit of an overview, a bit of what you might call our own federal framework for protecting the environment and human health, and about the statute for which I'm responsible, which is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And within it, it's regulations and supposedly more specifically about some pigs and fish that probably are a little bit more relevant for this audience. But the other point I want to make too about this regulation is that the particular one I operate under provides full spectrum taxonomic coverage of anything in the animal kingdom, probably from nematodes all the way up to large animal livestock. So this is my little cartoon to explain, using a little bit of a chemistry, ion assimilation, or some kind of a sieve, if you like that, equation, to show how these different pieces fit together. So what determines who regulates what is determined by the claim being made for it. So if the organism is going to be used in a feed, and a lot of things do end up in feed, then we do. And I was impressed actually with the explanation I saw from the US FDA. It's like a one-shop operation, because ours is a little bit partitioned out. So if it's a seed or a seed, which are most of our crop plants, fertilizer or veterinary biologic. So most of these are going to be mostly more lower organisms, but there could be some that fit in these categories. They're regulated by our Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the equivalent in Canada of APHIS in the United States. If it's a pest control product, then we have a separate agency for that that regulates pesticides. We have an arrangement for our Health Canada agency that regulates foods and drugs, wherein they conduct their normal human health assessment for foods and drugs and so on. But there's an arrangement whereby our own law and statute is used to do environmental assessments of those as well. And lastly, that little ball that appears at the bottom is what you might call a safety net, or the backstop of our regulatory system, which says if it doesn't fit in one of the categories above, it defaults to that one there. So everything else it fits through. So we have basically a regulation which is very generic in its look. And all of the information requirements in that regulation are actually all specified. We can't make anything up, so to speak, on the fly. It's not easily done. So Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which I mentioned, is responsible for novel plants. That's the terminology they use. So this is the terminology they use, is plants with novel traits. It also regulates feeds, fertilizers, veterinary biologics. As I mentioned, Health Canada has two big entities within it. One regulates, does a lot of healthy environments and consumer safety. So they're our partners in the program I'm about to explain. But another part of our health department regulates foods, and another part regulates pesticides. So we have a new name. I don't know if you pay attention, maybe it doesn't garner much public attention, but there was a new government that just was elected on October the 19th. So it's a month old, and we were given a new name of our department. So I've got climate change embedded in our names. We're still trying to figure that out, whether we should be called ECCC, something like that. Fisheries and Oceans Canada, we have an arrangement with, so they provide us with specific fisheries advice. We want to make use of the expertise where it exists in the federal government. Agriculture Canada really looks at more the trade aspects of trade in agricultural commodities. So they're all partners, they're all involved. So the act that I work under provides that safety net idea that was in that little illustration I used before. It's not technology based. It's not based on a specific, what I would call a product category, like a feed or a drug. And it uses terminology like whether it's new or not. And this is based in the United States. There's a TSCA New Substances Program. And this is sort of like the biology or biotechnology parallel to that kind of a program. So in our trigger words, again, you can see that this sort of has maybe a chemical trigger. There's the legal words that we have in our legislation. It's based on whether you import or manufacture in order to create something that is new. And we have, again, a microorganism list which determines what is new or not. And then we have this coverage that also provides for animals that covers that full taxonomic spectrum that I mentioned before. The other aspect, unique perhaps, with that piece of legislation is that it bonds two departments to work together. You could talk about interagency interaction all the time, but this statute forces us to cooperate. So you've got the department or the entity responsible for human health assessment that's dedicated to doing that. And where I am, we're responsible for the environmental component. And the two pieces of the pie have to come together to make a common decision. And that's how that works. It's a collaborative effort. We look at both the environment, which includes biological diversity, and our sister department looks at the human life and health. And we have to come to a common conclusion. Either side could come could identify a risk if they wanted to or if they needed to. And so we reach a common conclusion in that way. Here's some of the examples. Now, this is some of these you'll probably recognize, but we don't regulate very many crop plants. But in one case, in our legislation, something is called a seed if it's intended to be planted in the ground, but it's called a grain if it's brought in the country for processing into something else. So when there was one case where there was a grain that was imported to the country to be ground up, and it had a fish protein in a plant product. So maybe it's a sort of a farmer product. We regulated that under our statute. You may have heard about transgenic salmon. Maybe hear more about that tomorrow. We do a lot. Our bread and butter basically is genetically modified and naturally occurring microorganisms that are manufactured. Manufacturing is our trigger. So we still regulate contained production facilities of microorganisms under our statute. We have regulated, I just heard mention of the EnviroPig. We did the environmental assessment of that. And we ended up doing that assessment. It's actually a sanitized version of the risk assessment is on our website for anyone to have a look at in terms of how we came to that conclusion for that particular one. We imposed something under your TSCA. You're familiar with a SNR, significant new use rule. And we have something called we have to just change the letter, so we call it significant new activity. And that just means we set out in a statute in our the Canada Gazette, Federal Register in United States language, that says that this sets out the circumstance under which a new notification will be required. So that's a way to kind of put things into a bit of a containment. So both with the EnviroPig and with the Aqua Bounty salmon, because we regulated that as well, we basically said what you're proposing to do is just fine with us. But if you're familiar with normal transgenic pig, let's just talk about that for the moment. It's quite secure. You cannot just waltz in there. You have to take a shower to go in. You'll want one also when you leave. But nevertheless, there's a lot of containment built into regular. So we just said that provides a lot of biosafety just by the very nature of the way that animal is produced. So it's well contained. So we just said for that particular case and for the EnviroPig, that you're fine to produce that in Canada from an environmental point of view because it's not going to get out of a contained facility and you've got all your existing procedures in place to make sure that it's well controlled. We were concerned a little bit about what it might mean because we didn't have any other environmental data on that particular pig. They ask for, under our statute allows for particular information elements to be waived under certain circumstances. So if you've got a good rationale for why something should be waived, then we may accept that. I mean, that's also a legal step that we have to publish when something is waived. So in that case, we did not ask for the data that we normally would for a test on invasiveness. So since there are, believe it or not, in cold Canada, there are feral pig populations around, we didn't want that pig to be wandering around accidentally. So the other thing about the legislation that we have is that once the information is deemed complete, and it may take a little while to get there, the legislation actually fixes the amount of time we have available to do the assessment. So this is quite attractive, I think, to some companies because it means we can't go on and on asking for more information. Once that information package is deemed complete, a little time clock starts ticking, and we've got for both microorganisms and for, that's 1 and 5 in that chart. So if that's for introduction anywhere in the country, so that's full environmental release, we basically have 120 days to do that, complete that assessment. So we hear that drum beating as soon as that green light happens to flash up that the information is deemed to be complete. The other categories there are microorganism-specific categories, depending on, again, on what level of activity or what level of exposure, if you will, if you look at those different categories, is being proposed. So I just wanted to put this slide up. We don't publish all risk assessment decisions. We publish a selection of them. So that's kind of a long convoluted. I guess this will all become, these will all be available, these presentations, and that'll be a clickable link, hopefully, so you don't have to don't write that down. Normally we get asked this about whether there's a public comment period in our legislation. There is no provision. It's very difficult to do that. There was for the case of AquaBounty, there was a special, because of the involvement of our Fisheries and Oceans Department, there was a different process there. There was a scientific peer review that was done sort of internal to government. That was part of that process. So that was a very well reviewed particular risk assessment in that particular case, but normally that's not done routinely. It's not transactional. Our time period does not allow for it. So if that were to become part of any future recommendation, we would have to say, well, we want more than 120 days to do that risk assessment. And the way that we do the risk assessment is the proponent provides all the information, lest anyone think that the proponent is doing the risk assessment. We want to be clear that it's the government that does the risk assessment. We get information that is provided by the proponent. It's all stated in the regulation itself, what has to be provided. And we do the risk assessment based on what's provided and our own expertise and whatever else we can glean from experts if we need to find them. Because we have to be, if we need to be, we have to be entomologists as well as livestock professionals as well as fisheries scientists. So we have to be quite generic in our terms of our skill set. When the risk assessment is done, this is again part of the language we use. Bureaucrats invent language to suit their own purposes. So we use the word toxic here. This does not mean toxic in the chemical sense. Toxic means it's bad enough that we have to do something about it. It means it's going to have or could have an adverse effect on the environment or on biodiversity or on human health. So, and that if we said that something was toxic, it could mean that we would then go into risk management mode, and then we would be able to impose stringent conditions and so on. I heard mention about monitoring and so on post-release. We could only do that, as our risk assessment program works, if we said that it was toxic and the risk was such that it required risk management that might require monitoring. We don't routinely require monitoring per se as a result of a risk assessment. Most of what we do ends up in the non-toxic category, and that middle category is what I talked about before, where we're going to impose that significant new activity. So it's not, we're not saying it's toxic, and in the way we use our risk assessment terminology, we've got, there's a hazard component, there's an exposure component. So we're only talking about, okay, the proponent has described the activity as A, B, and C, but we can envision X, Y, and Z over here, and that may be a different usage pattern, and that could be a different exposure, and we're reserving the right to relook at the risk assessment decision we made to look at that new situation so that we can do another risk assessment in that case. So that's that middle category. EnviroPig. EnviroPig was interesting. As far as I know, that was a very interesting one. Too bad it didn't go anywhere. But again, this is a very controversial, or can be very complicated to try and get these to do the. Well, you cannot. Our job is to do the risk assessment. Our job is not to influence, or to be part of the marketing decision. And that one was stopped in Canada, I think, because it was a University of Guelph project, because basically I think the research funding ceased and there wasn't enough pull from the industry or from the marketing side or from the local growers to kind of pull that along. So I think it still exists in theory or is frozen embryo somewhere, but I don't think there's no alive animals that I'm aware of in Canada anymore. We also did under our legislation the Aqua Bounty genetically modified salmon, which is produced has a hatchery and an egg production facility in Prince Edward Island. And that one also, in that case, again, that rule that I talked about, the significant new activity, was imposed on that situation as well to ensure, or as a way to say, our assessment is based on what you've told us you're going to do, which is that basically it's a fully contained facility in Canada. So if any activity other than that was going to be anticipated, that would require a new notification. So that's the legal language we would use, and that's what the document says about how that risk assessment is the context to that decision. Here, I've mentioned the word gene editing. So this is a challenge. I think that we don't have anything specific. I'm very eager to see what the National Academies come out with in terms of documentation and what the results of this. I don't know if there will be recommendations coming out of this meeting or not. We think that for the most part right now, from what I see, it's not going to be immune from our regulations. I will be interested to know, and this will have to be discussed. I like some of the terminology used by Argentina about considerations for the future, about what will happen when the technology progresses to the point of view where it's indistinguishable, because that's the discussion that's been happening somewhat for SCNT clones, as long as there are still distinguishable elements there. But when your technology comes to the point of view, and then you start looking at progeny, but when the regulator has difficulty figuring out what are you going to do when it's not distinguishable, then you're really, you've probably, you've closed a circle there. Communications is always tricky for government because you want to defend what your government, the risk assessment side of it, but there's multiple roles for government, so you can't say that the entire decision, yay or nay, is entirely within the regulatory side. But certainly there is a lot more consumer involvement in this present day and age, and a lot more need for good communications out and good communication products. So this is the last slide. We've got lots of information there on our website and so on, and I hope we make you take advantage of it, and I'm looking forward to your questions as part of the panel. Thank you.